Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to trace the absolutely startling evolution of human conflict. For centuries, warfare was something you could physically see, hear, and touch, right? Lines of soldiers, the roar of muskets, the rumble of tanks. But as we're about to see, the traditional battlefield is quite literally disappearing. Today, we're moving rapidly from physical trenches to the invisible, algorithmic, and highly cognitive battlegrounds of tomorrow. Here is our chronological roadmap for today. 1. The changing face of war. 2. The physical generations 1 to 3. 3. Generation 4, irregular warfare. 4. Generation 5, cognitive warfare. 5. Generation 6, autonomous warfare. And finally, 6. The disappearing human element. Part 1. The changing face of war. Looking at the evolution from the physical clashes of the first generation back in 1648, all the way to the autonomous AI of the sixth generation, it reveals a pretty startling trend. The time between these massive generational shifts is exponentially shortening. While those early generations lasted centuries, the leaps from the fourth to the fifth to the sixth generation, they're basically overlapping in real time right before our eyes. Part 2. The physical generations, 1 to 3. Okay, let's break this down. For centuries, traditional military history evolved across 3 distinct physical phases. The first generation was completely defined by lines and columns of soldiers with muskets. Think of those classical post-Westphalian battles. Then, the second generation was born out of the Industrial Revolution. It brought mass firepower, railroads, and the brutal, grinding trench warfare of attrition. And then the third generation completely disrupted those static trenches with speed and maneuverability. This was mechanized warfare, like the blitzkrieg tactics we saw in World War II. But the key takeaway here? For hundreds of years, it was state armies fighting state armies, and the strategy was largely physical. Part 3, Generation 4, irregular warfare. Now, fourth-generation warfare totally disrupted that conventional model. Suddenly, state armies were finding their massive mechanized forces pretty much useless against decentralized non-state actors. This era is completely defined by irregular warfare, insurgency, terrorism, and asymmetric tactics. The main goals shifted from destroying an enemy's military head-on to attacking vulnerable populations, infrastructure, and political will. But it's important to note, even here, the conflict remained primarily kinetic and physical. Part 4. Generation 5, cognitive warfare. And this is where things get really wild. Fifth-generation warfare shifts the battlefield directly into the human mind. It establishes the absolute primacy of the cognitive and virtual domains. Instead of kinetic violence, it uses perceptive and generative AI to manipulate an observer's context and their very reality. The ultimate objective isn't to physically destroy the enemy, it's actually to achieve social, political, and military paralysis without firing a single bullet. The sheer scale of the digital weapons used in 5GW is just staggering. It literally turns the things we interact with daily, like social media platforms and their dopamine loops, into completely invisible battlegrounds. Tactics include data-driven misinformation, deepfakes, and social engineering designed specifically to trigger our existing cognitive biases and create new ones. According to our sources, we actually saw precursors to this during the Arab Spring. In fact, some analysts call that the first accidental fifth-generation conflict because of how social media spontaneously drove societal-scale decision-making. This idea is perfectly captured in Daniel Abbott's handbook on the subject. He notes that the very nature of fifth-generation warfare is that it is difficult to define. It is explicitly designed to be unseen. When it's applied correctly, the very use of these technologies is entirely concealed. It is basically a vortex of disinformation, chaos, and psychological conflict, where you might not even realize you're a combatant or a target in a war of perception. Which brings us to a terrifying modern anomaly known as the attribution problem. In traditional warfare, you know exactly who you're fighting. But in 5GW, the attack vectors are highly ambiguous. Our sources point to phenomena like Havana syndrome, where diplomats suffered neurological symptoms from a completely unknown source as a prime symptom of 5GW. It checks all the boxes, right? Ambiguity of the opposing force, a concealed attack vector, and absolute deniability. You are definitely being attacked, but it's practically impossible to definitively say by whom. Part 5. Generation 6, autonomous warfare. So if 5G manipulates human perception, 6G is a completely different beast. It's a war of system versus system. While 5G is cognitive warfare between state and non-state actors, 6G is autonomous warfare heavily driven by technological superpowers. Power no longer comes just from advanced physical platforms, but from data systems, digital infrastructure, and fully autonomous machine cognition. Interestingly, long before AI was mainstream, military theorists were totally seeing this coming. Back in 1999, Russian Major General Vladimir Slipchenko predicted this concept of no-contact warfare. He foresaw distant combat heavily reliant on command, control, computers, and intelligence networks, what the military calls C4ISR. The big idea here is that the advanced side simply stays outside the geographical zone of the enemy's weapons, conducting algorithmic precision strikes from afar without ever making physical contact. And what's crazy is that sixth-generation warfare converges all these domains into a permanent gray zone competition. Physical drone swarms integrate seamlessly with cyber networks, and they all converge on the cognitive domain, both human and artificial. There's no clear front line in 6GW. It is just a continuous, simultaneous operation happening across land, sea, air, cyber, and space. Part 6. The disappearing human element. This brings us to the terrifying leap of automation in combat, which essentially happens in 3 stages. We start with human in the loop, where a machine explicitly needs a human's permission to act. Next is human on the loop, where the machine operates, but a human is supervising and can intervene if needed. And finally, we reach human out of the loop, fully autonomous systems operating entirely without human instruction or supervision. Why does this happen? Well, because the speed of 6GW is so incredibly fast, human reasoning actually becomes a massive liability. Theorists call this pulsating warfare, which is combat happening literally at the speed of machines. Fully autonomous weapon systems operating on hyper-accelerated decision cycles, or OODA loops, will collect data, make strategic decisions, and execute lethal actions entirely on their own. No human operator can act with sufficient speed to intercept a threat in this environment, which essentially pushes humans out of the decision-making loop entirely. Because of this, in this cyber-futuristic era, traditional intelligence gathering just isn't enough anymore. We now require a completely new intelligence discipline called cognit, or cognitive intelligence. Its entire purpose is to map, safeguard, and operationally exploit decision-making architectures. It fuses cognitive science with machine learning to identify biases and behavioral anomalies. In an era where manipulating a decision is literally more powerful than dropping a bomb, cognit becomes the ultimate defensive and offensive tool. So, as we leave the old battlefields of muskets and trenches far behind for a world of algorithmic escalation, invisible cognitive manipulation, and autonomous machine swarms, it leaves us with one haunting question to ponder. When the battlefield completely disappears into the digital ether and machines fight machines at speeds we can't even perceive, will tomorrow's enemy even be human? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the reality around you.